1966. You call that a biscuit? Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the crossroads of the 18th century where biscuit officially started to become a confusing word. It involves climate differences, wood ash, the rise of sugar in baked goods, kitchen one-upmanship, and quite probably a fair bit of boredom. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that this is one of those episodes I have been looking forward to doing basically since this whole podcast was a vague idea in my cluttered brain. The whole genre of couple of bite-sized wheat flour baked goods that hang out under the name biscuit has been a bit of a mystery to me. Why all these different things? How did it happen? Is anyone right? As with my aversion for deciding the correct pronunciation of French sugar candies, I am also not going to air my opinions on which biscuit is the best biscuit, but I will generally explain the 18th century versions and include practical recipes in the show notes. So let's start at the beginning, the boring bit that is repeated at the top of any article or anything about the biscuit, the origin of the word. Baked wheat stuff has been with Europe for thousands of years. The group that kept the most records are the Romans, so the word biscuit is based on Latin, of course, and since it's an imported baking term applied to wheat flour that arrived in England, it's been filtered through culinary French. The Latin term bis coctus translates its meaning as twice baked. You can hear the term embedded in the name biscotti, that often too hard to bite cookie type thing that was all the rage in the 1990s, and continues on because it's a tasty cookie that keeps. Partly because it does go through two separate rounds of baking, one for cooking and one for drying. Which allows me to jump ahead to what was firmly established as a biscuit in the 17th century. Much like their Roman military ancestors, English 17th century biscuit was a flour and water dough that was baked once to cook the flour to make it more digestible, and then baked at a lower temperature to dry out and make it last. This mainly meant it was harder for the competitive creepy crawlies, single-celled and six-legged, to eat it all up before the humans got to them. Judging by the mountains of complaints of finding grubs and worms and beetles in ship's biscuit, this was an imperfect solution. But everyone was in agreement that it was still a better idea than shipping the grain or the ground flour as food on a boat. Both of those would get far more ruined by life at sea than the lightly inhabited biscuit. And this is the biscuit that arrived in what was to become America. As you might guess, in this land of make-do and innovation, and frankly all the people making guild rules about how things are done remaining on the other side of the Atlantic, some changes were made. As we arrive in the 18th century, the plain ship's biscuit continues to be made. Sailors gotta sail, and to keep them doing that, they gotta eat. And to eat ship's biscuit, it had to be broken up in some manner and soaked in hot liquids to become at all edible. This led to things like lobscouse and the humbler seaborne version of the sea pie from episode 57, since we are before widely available potatoes. The 18th century is before widespread white or Irish potatoes, or if you want to get technical, potatoes from around the Andes and generally the west side of South America. Ship's biscuit is currently in the food location that will be filled by them very soon. So ship's biscuit are bashed apart, crumbled, and then cooked in stews as a thickener and as a calorie adder, the way potatoes will come to be used once they make it into the English and colonial diet at the very end of the 18th century. In fact, potatoes were so handy, they have nearly erased some biscuit history. For there's another English and European technique of Middle Ages origin that we mostly have forgotten because, frankly, it was a huge pain. Besides the arrival of potatoes, the 18th century brought better mills and chemical leavening happened. So what every baker happily, even gleefully left behind was a process of absolutely beating the living daylights out of your dough. In that time, where wheat flour had made it to England, but the Romans had gotten wet and cold feet and given up and gone home, there was a practice of making a dough and then repeatedly folding it and beating it with a stick to make a unique, stretchy, shiny, blistery dough that would cook into hard biscuits, but were slightly risen inside. They were markedly more tender and appetizing than the impossible blocks of the indifferently made flour and water paste ship's biscuit type things. The first place I ever encountered tell of these things was in the second book of Nancy Farmer's Sea of Trolls trilogy, The Land of the Silver Apples. But once I was looking, I have also found a reference to a similar item as an item buried by armies of legendary India, to be broken open and eaten with ghee. In the 18th century, England still had ship's biscuits, but they were also in the process of developing crisp biscuits and sweet biscuits. As far as I've been able to tell, the laborious pounded dough travel biscuits of the medieval era and pilgrimages had disappeared. Better understanding of barm and yeast and the addition of sugar, along with better control of cooking temperatures through the importation of continental stove and oven technology, were the way baked goods became more tender and fancy, rather than the application of simply brute force. I mean, labor was expensive enough that it mostly wasn't to be deployed in completely foolish fashions. Ever since the repeated visits of the Black Death, peasants had become thin enough on the ground that it was determined they should be treated a bit better. That, and they were leaving to seek their fortunes in the big city or in the colonies if you treated them too terribly. It's amazing what people will not put up with if they can leave when they want to. But in the colonies, far from the the King's English, and briefly Cromwell's English, but mainly the King's English, things were afoot that were shaking up the baked goods nomenclature world. First of all, tin. Tin baking sheets and then tin baking pans were becoming available. So instead of just baking on the oven floor or in cake hoops, there were now sheets and metal pans that allowed for smaller things and more intricately shaped things to be baked in ovens and to be easily put in and removed in batches. These batch-cooked items, sweet and savory, continued to be called biscuits in England, but the sweet ones in the colonies, especially those being baked near the center of Dutch influence in New York, these were being called cookies. From the Dutch word koekjes, meaning little cakes. The German baking traditions and their habit of calling cakes kuchen helped spread the cookie word all over wheat-rich Pennsylvania as well. So sweet biscuits had lost their chance to stay biscuits almost as soon as baking with sugar became common in the colonies. Sure, they were called sweet biscuits in areas that thought of themselves as more British than proto-American. Yankees were more likely to use cookie than Southerners, who tended to hold more tenaciously to English cooking conventions. So all things like sugar biscuits, finger biscuits, and London biscuits would persist. In the end, cookies it was. But that's understandable, simple, easy to follow. The big mystery is how in the world did savory biscuits get fluffy in the New World, but remain crispy or rock hard in England? First of all, the ship's biscuits, they are going nowhere. They will continue to exist as they are, just getting some new names like hardtack and crackers and eventually pilot biscuit or pilot crackers. The story around why biscuits became crackers seems to invoke the fact that you have to crack them apart to use them, or that it came from the sounds they made when one was beating up the biscuits into usable pieces. I have become suspicious of these sound-based origins of American food words. But multiple people who say they invented crackers in the early 19th century will also claim sound as a reason for the names, so there might be something to it. However it came about, the name cracker for ship's biscuit-type objects was in use by the mid to late 18th century, before the Revolutionary War. For it not only appears in Amelia Simmons's printed 1796 book, but also in other manuscript collections of recipes from even earlier, as a way of referring to broken up flour and water biscuits used in stews and puddings. At this point, you might be reasonably asking, why make biscuits at all if they seem to be such a plague to the culinary world? Well, as I mentioned before, they store better than bread or grain or flour. But other appreciated facts about biscuits was that they were a ready-to-eat baked good that did not require a barm or yeast rise that typically took overnight. They were a quick bread, so to speak. This was a known and appreciated technology in a world where everything took forever to make or was always going moldy, getting eaten by bugs or mice or rats. So once you had figured out something that was pretty quick to make and stayed good, the next challenge was how to make it edible without extensive stewing. So that's exactly what happened next. Innovations were made, and the colonists first came up with the work biscuit, which was basically ship's biscuit but with a little fat and salt added. These could go in your purse or pack and keep, but the fat made it possible to eat them on the go, or at least with a lot less liquid than their shipboard forebears. So once the immediate crisis was solved, then it was time to come up with something for the genteel folks. You know, people eating with forks and using tablecloths and those new imported porcelain dishes. This is where we first run across the durable tradition of the Southern beaten biscuit. We have to remember that many a genteel 18th century lady carried among her treasures a manuscript cookbook that might go back to the 17th or even the 16th century. The Martha Washington's Book of Cookery is one of these. She didn't compile the book. It was a family heirloom, written in multiple hands and clearly started in England before the Dandridge family came to Virginia. It was a reference. It was used, but it was a bit old-fashioned for the day. Much of the spelling is out of date for the 18th century, and techniques had evolved since they had been written down. All the same, this sort of work was in the hands of many Southern women who were in charge of running the hospitality for their plantation estates, for family, for guests, planned or drop-in, and for big parties. In these heirloom manuscripts of cookery, those English pounded biscuits lurked, and they came back out in a memorable new form, once again as a display of power through food in the southern British colonies. The fancy beaten biscuit renaissance started with two things. One was the softer winter wheat of the South. The other was the enslaved workers in the kitchen of Southern households, which allowed them to use complex or labor-intensive food preparations as displays of power and luxury. The winter wheat, or soft wheat, that grew most successfully in the southern colonies had and continues to have a lower protein content than the wheat that was grown in the northern colonies. About 12% versus 9% if you're curious. The winter and summer nature of each of these wheats was purely a weather pattern consideration. Lower protein in wheat functionally means less gluten, the thing that makes wheat bread stretchy. More gluten, more stretch, and a greater ability to hold air. So also in risen baked goods, more bounce or spring. Less gluten, things are more dense, and you end up with a more crumbly texture. Cornbread, of course, is the extreme end of crumbly, as corn has no gluten at all. But within wheat, breads and other baked goods are going to be more or less bouncy depending on how much gluten is in them, unless you dry them out. Then it's a question of how tooth-breaking the resulting dried biscuit is, and that comes down to how thick an item it is. And, as I've established, most ship's biscuits and other dried-out flour and water dough thingies of this age were pretty thick, so had to be violently pounded into crumbs and then soaked in hot liquid to be edible. But now that the colonies had things like butter, lard, second stories, and gardens for delight along with custards, it was time for less daunting and fancier savory biscuits as well. As with the work biscuits, adding fat to the dough, even a little, makes them a bit nicer. At the time, this was referred to as making them short, that is, flakier or easier to break up, which makes sense of the word shortening and things like short crust or short bread. Another way to make biscuits easier to eat is to add air. In a familiar example, this is done in puff pastry by layering butter in, which contains water, which then turns to steam while baking, puffing the layers apart. But in a recipe where you're only adding a little fat, as in those medieval travel biscuits, instead, you literally beat air into the dough. Wait, how? What? What are you talking about? Okay, a dough made of flour, a little fat, and then milk or buttermilk or water were mixed into a stiff dough. A typical recipe would be a quart of flour, 4 rounded tablespoons of lard, and a cup of buttermilk or water. And that gives you a sense of the proportions. That means there was some fat, but only about a half an ounce or 1 tablespoon per cup of flour. That's about 15 grams of fat per 120 grams of flour, or just generally a ratio of around 1 to 8 or 1 to 10 fat to flour. For comparison, pie crust or pastry dough and shortbread have a fat to flour ratio closer to 1 fat to 2 flour, and puff pastry is closer to 1.25 fat to 2 flour. So the beaten biscuits were still clearly a biscuit, not a delicate pastry. By repeatedly folding and beating a dough, you can cause the gluten to get busted apart. You get stretchy strands, but not the sturdy aligned sheets that are caused by kneading. Further, beating the dough also produces friction-caused heat, which in turn makes some of the starch granules in the flour gelatinize. Thoroughly pounded dough was accomplished in sessions lasting 30 minutes to up to 2 hours. Instructions directed a baker to hit the dough from as few as 200 to over 1,000 times. Implements ranging from a rolling pin, axe handles, or the side of a hatchet were reported to have been used. The result of this repeated folding and pounding was a strange, shiny-looking, smooth dough that trapped air bubbles. The dough would literally start to blister and make snapping sounds as trapped bubbles would pop through this bubble-gummy textured dough. Cut into squares or circles, these beaten biscuits were docked or pricked to keep their tops even as they puffed up while they were baked in a medium to low oven, the equivalent of the modern 325 Fahrenheit or about 160 C. While only baked once, these were baked at a temperature that cooked the flour and dried out the outside and the delicate layers inside, making this biscuit durable. It lasted without going stale the way bread did, but could also be easily split open to expose a softer, tender inside. So how did the docking or pricking keep the biscuit tops even? This seemed to be a bit of a mystery. As reference to something more familiar to the modern baker, this is the same thing that's done when blind baking pie crusts to keep them from puffing up. Some bakers contend it's done to let out steam, but it can't let all the steam out or the biscuits wouldn't puff up at all. Others contend it sticks the dough together a bit to keep one spot from over-rising with a big bubble. After some poking around in dough nerd land, it seems that docking does interrupt big bubble chambers, but it also allows the cracker or biscuit to bake more evenly. It creates more surface area for heat to get into the baked good, so it reduces spots that stay elastic and can stretch for longer, and allows the biscuit or cracker to dry out and become crispy or rock hard, depending, more easily. But where this all gets us in the savory biscuit mystery trail I set us on is that these soft wheat flour doughs that had air literally beaten into them were a midpoint in the rock-hard ship's biscuit to fluffy southern biscuit evolution. The important thing that can get lost in beaten biscuit discussions is that they were only made possible and then popularized by people who purchased a kitchen workforce and then deployed their labor in ridiculously wasteful ways. The end of slavery, serfdom, and villein laws in Europe had done in the beaten biscuits once. They were only revived as a new population in a new world once again had a kitchen workforce that were required to provide their labor at no additional cost to the people who had purchased them. Beating biscuit dough was often relegated to enslaved children, with the women who enslaved them bragging about how long they kept the children at the task. As a result of this labor flex, the beaten biscuit that had a nice rise, a crispy outside, and a tender center was seen as a mark of luxury and refinement. To prove the point that no one who had a choice in the matter would regularly beat up on biscuit dough for hours by choice, after the Civil War, the biscuit break appeared. This was basically a bumpy pasta roller. It allowed a cook to fold and pummel the dough by sending it through some rollers for 20 minutes instead of wailing on it for, say, an hour. Alternately, beaten biscuits were relegated to large celebration meals where the menfolk would be sent outside to beat up on dough with axe handles and such while women were working inside with fire. But, as an always-on-hand luxury food, the beaten biscuit will once again largely disappear, though even now it continues to reappear as a nostalgia celebration food, though now there's always a mechanical helper involved. But the thing that really spelled the end for the 1000 wax beaten biscuit was this newfangled chemical yeast stuff. Starting in around 1740, it was discovered that the leachate of hardwood ash, the stuff used to nixtamalize corn or make soap, if that solution was left to dry, a grayish-white powder formed. This is our potash and the future potassium source. If it was heated, some impurities would off-gas or be converted, and the resulting material would be these white, shiny beads, and that became known as pearl ash. And this was fairly pure potassium carbonate, K2NO3 for those of you following along at home. The trail of how we got from nixtamalization and soap ashes to chemical leavening is a history and chemistry lesson for another season. The important thing to know here is that it arrived in the 18th century, and it was pretty available to city dwellers in the 18th century because charcoal, wood ashes, and the associated leached water and potash were all big business in the New World, where there appeared to be infinite wood. The wood business, logs, boards, shingles, barrels, and burned byproducts were so much a part of the New World, pearl ash would become a typical ingredient in the colonies before it was common back in England. A real technology flip that would start to become more common going forward. These little nodules of pearl ash, when ground in a kitchen mortar and pestle and mixed with water, a caustic or basic solution was produced. In soap making, this was used to saponify fats. See bonus episode 35.5 for details. In baking, when mixed with an acid like sour milk, clabbered buttermilk, vinegar, or molasses, it made bubbles, which led to lighter baked goods and the name chemical yeast. Unlike modern chemical leavening, which is finer ground and tends to have a heat release element, especially modern baking powder, pearl ash's rise didn't last all that long. So mixtures where it was used as a rising agent needed to get into the oven quickly so the rise could be baked in. Which gets us, finally, to the fluffy southern biscuit we think of. Just as with the beaten biscuit, this depends on the low-protein soft flour and more fat than in beaten biscuits, usually double the amount, and yes, the pearl ash, which can be very reasonably thought of as colonial baking soda. Well, beaten biscuits could be made with milk, water, or buttermilk to get the new extra fluffy pearl ash biscuits, or soda biscuits as they came to be called, to happen. Clabber or sour milk had to be used to get the bubbles to happen. And because the bubbles didn't last long, once the bubbles started, those biscuits had to get in the oven quick, which is why the earliest pearl ash biscuits were drop biscuits, which incidentally made them the highest tech biscuit of the century. They used this new leavening agent, and because of their wetter nature and the batch baking technique, they also had to be baked on one of these newfangled tin sheets. These were a fancy house food for sure. The beaten biscuits were sturdy and held together on their own, but these drop biscuits wouldn't make it if placed on the oven floor. A typical soda biscuit recipe would use 2 tablespoons or 30 grams of fat per cup of flour versus the single tablespoon in the beaten biscuits, already making for a more tender final product. The fat would be worked into the flour, making it crumbly looking. Typically, no salt would be added to the flour because remember, salt was already in the butter even when it had been washed. If rendered pork or chicken or beef fat was the animal fat instead of butter, then some salt might be added if it was available. The crushed pearl ash would be stirred into an acidy liquid, the clabber or buttermilk or maybe some vinegar, and this would be quickly stirred into the flour and fat mixture. Between being made with a lower protein flour, being stirred together quickly, and dropped from a spoon instead of being shaped and rolled, there was really very little chance for gluten strands to build up. So the resulting baked good is going to be extremely tender and crumbly. But unlike every other biscuit we've talked about, these were made to be eaten hot. They crush, they crumble, they fall apart. But oh my goodness, they were revolutionarily good. And so this earliest of early American, well, not yet American quick breads was created. And that whole thing is how biscuits mean one thing more or less on our side of the Atlantic and a whole bunch of other things back on the English side. Going forward, I'll get into things like scones and wigs, or wig cakes, soda bread and coffee cake, and look at the rise of the cracker and the diversification of the cookie. But for now, we've solved the biscuit mystery and can move on to the next topic. And what will that next topic be? 18th century wood and charcoal. After mentioning so many wood products and byproducts, it's time to drill down into the 18th century world of wood, including some of the British royal policies around wood that were agitating the colonists and making them more susceptible to all this rebellion talk. Sure, it's not food, but without it, there was no food. And there are things about the mixing of different cultures' uses of wood that created new, soon-to-be American things we now take for granted. But back in the 18th century, they would be brand new, original, hybrid technologies, only to be found in 18th century North America. To find out what I'm talking about, join me next week for my episode on wood and charcoal and everything they meant then. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Questions or quibbles will reach me by email at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com or on Twitter at @THOAFood, where I'm most active. A few words to review this podcast on your favorite podcast widget really do make a difference and help make me more visible to the food and history curious alike. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta bios at THOAFood and in the show description.